Even though the 1919 race riots was a great tragedy because of the amount of bloodshed, we can still bring out something good from it. For instance, the civil rights was a triumph of the race riots because of many actions that had occurred during the race riots. Racial act conduct by both sides, deaths of Eugene Williams, and corrupt racial government officials such as officers and or jury are all points that play a role in how the tragedy of race riots eventually led to the triumph of civil rights. With that being said, the following documentary will be about when blacks started to stand up for themselves, which led to the 1919 race riots, which when eventually led to the civil rights.
The civil rights movement was one of the most influential and recent movements in this century. The impact that it had can still be seen today all across the nation and even beyond it. The rise of the most prominent historical figures such as Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., and Malcolm X were the leaders of this movement. But where and why did this movement come about? The civil rights movement slowly gained traction due to events that were happening all around the country, revealing injustices towards certain races. One of these events was the 1919 race riots.
The 1919 race riots had a large impact on the future of the civil rights movement because of its importance of taking place in Chicago. The racial violence that took place from both sides, the corruption from the government that did not handle the situation the way it should have been, and multiple other injustices has happened. How did the race riots begin in the first place though? World War I has just ended, and people blacks and whites are coming home only to find their jobs taken by blacks that migrated from the south to escape the racism. So when the riots start on both sides, the blacks and whites have highly trained soldiers with automatic guns. Another big factor of the 1919 race riots was the segregation of blacks to the south side and the invisible color line separating the blacks and whites. But this color line was made up, it had no legal stance, it was enforced by racist whites to keep Chicago white. Let's go a little farther back to a couple of days before the 1919 race riots when a dirigible, a blimp, crashed into the Illinois Trust and saving buildings and disappearance of a little white girl that led to a citywide investigation. Eventually, it was found out that she was kidnapped and murdered by a pedophile, which enlarged the whole city when he was arrested. Finally, people had a face of person to hate when it came to the pedophile problem in Chicago at the time, and the cherry on top to this roller coaster of emotions all happened in a week time. A 17-year-old boy crossed the invisible color line, stone drowned, and the culprits are arrested. So the Chicagoans do the only logical things at the time, exploding, letting out all their emotions into a rise that affect the whole city and the history of the country.
The riots lasted for 13 days, and violence ran rapid around the city. Events as terrible as people being stoned were found, and social injustice soon became apparent. Newspapers had multiple false headlines that were later soon to be fake. The crisis, with a majority American audience that stated that headlines such as Negro brutally murders prominent citizen, Negro robs house, and the like have been appeared with alarming frequency, and the news articles beneath such headlines have been the same sort. As you can tell from the newspapers, the whole city was polarly divided. Almost twice as many African Americans were imprisoned than whites, and the cause of most of the violence was perpetrated by athletic clubs that were just a guise for the white gangs. Something notable is that Mayor Richard J. Daley was part of one of these gangs, but neither confirmed nor denied his involvement towards the riots. The atrocities happening around the city caused the National Guard to send 6,000 of its soldiers to attempt to keep the peace. By the end of the riots, hundreds were left homeless and more than 35 were killed.
Lastly, corrupt newspapers and government officials, such as officers, did not work based off of evidence, but by racial evidence they could have found by looking at those caught at the scene. Reports talks about corrupt officers being more than willing to arrest a colored rioter than a white rioter. State's attorney Hoyne openly charged the police with arresting colored rioters and with the willingness to arrest white rioters. This quote shows that there were in fact officers that were corrupt and not doing their duties as an officer. According to our sources, it also states that in a few minutes, the light-colored men and the five white were released and their ammunition given back to them with the remark, "You probably knew this before the night is over." This quote shows that even the police work in, worked in jail had allowed them to walk out and possibly commit these crimes. The officers had arrested several colored males who were in the five white men, but they had not released the colored men at the same time as the five white men.
Chicago was the third largest city in the nation at the time of the 1919 race riots, so the impact that it had was magnified. The 1919 race riots gained much more recognition than it would have if it had started in a city smaller, such as Boston, only one-fifth of the size of Chicago. Also, Chicago had more than 15 newspapers at the time, so the publicity of this event caught like wildfire. What happened after the race riots was as bad as the riots themselves. Instead of the African American workers going back to their regular jobs, the Union Stockyards, one of the largest employers in Chicago at the time, banned them in fear of more riots. And most stores had to stay closed because of property damage or feared the riots would resurface. Also, more injustices from the state were found. 17 indictments were found against African Americans with the intent of the death penalty. You might be asking yourself what happened in between 1919 and 1954 because of the 1919 race riots that benefited the civil rights movement. And this is why President Woodrow Wilson publicly blamed whites for being instigators of the race related riots in both Chicago and Washington, D.C., and introduced efforts for foster racial harmony and including voluntary organizations and congressional legislation, in addition to drawing attention to the growing tensions in America's urban centers. The riots in Chicago and other cities in the summer of 1919 marked the beginning of a growing willingness among African Americans to fight for their rights in the face of oppression and injustice. This was huge for the civil rights because for once the whites were the ones to blame. The president at the time went out of his way to show the facts that whites were being bluntly racist and discriminatory towards the blacks. They killed a 17-year-old over him swimming on a public beach because he crossed the imaginary line. Then the first responders refused to arrest the man eyewitnesses identified as the one who had killed the boy, which sparked a brawl that eventually spread to the rest of the city, but most blacks were on defense, getting attacked constantly by white gangs and police equally. The media was even worse at the time of the riots. It was even more in favor of the whites. Headlines would either shamefully lie or only report crimes committed by blacks. Examples of this are headlines such as Negro brutally murders prominent citizen and Negro robs house. This and shameful lies in the media added fuel to the fire, making the blacks out to be the main instigators, but it was the complete opposite. Even after the riots were over, people pushed for laws such as implementing zoning laws to formally segregate housing in Chicago or restrictions preventing blacks from working alongside whites in the stockyards and other industries. Such measures were rejected by African Americans and liberal white voters, and city officials instead organized Chicago commissions on race relations to look into the root causes of the riots and find ways to combat them. The commission, which included 6 white men and 6 black men, suggested several key issues, including competition for jobs, inadequate housing options for blacks, inconsistent law enforcement, and pervasive racial discrimination, which had a lasting effect along with many other race riots in 1919 that benefited the civil rights movement and was a huge stepping stone for the blacks in the US.